Good morning, everyone. Our topic this morning is from little to much, and then dependence on the Father. Ang text po natin is Luke chapter 9, verse 12 to 17, but we will also refer the other three Gospels because there are accounts in those Gospels that we cannot find in Luke number 9, verse 12 to 17. So these are Matthew 14, verse 15 to 21, and Mark 6, 35 to 44, and also John 6, verse 5 to 14. So let me read to you the text in Luke 9, verse 12 to 17. Let's read responsibly. I'll start with the first verse. These are 7 verses. In verse 12, now the day was ending, and the 12 came and said to him, send the crowd away, that they may go into the surrounding villages and countrysides and find lodging and get something to eat, for here we are in a desolate place. Come on, read aloud.
Go and buy for all these people.
For there were about 5,000 men, and he said to his disciples, have them sit down to eat in groups of about 50 each.
They did so and had them all sit down.
Then he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he blessed them and broke them, and kept giving them to the disciples to set before the people. And they all ate and were satisfied, and the broken pieces which they had left over were picked up, and 12 baskets full. Okay, that's the account of Luke chapter 9, verse 12 to 17. And it's very clear, no? The circumstance was that the day was about to end. It's almost night. And the disciples came to Jesus and then advised him to send the crowd away so that this crowd will go to the villages in the countryside and they will find lodging and get something to eat because they are in a desolate place. And then Jesus commanded them, give them something to eat. And then they said, we have no more than 5 loaves and 2 fish, unless perhaps we go and buy food for all these people. And Matthew says there were around 5,000 men, and or Luke, he says there was around about 5,000 men. When we say about, that's an approximate number, and Jesus took the 5 loaves, he looked up to heaven, and he blessed them and broke them and kept giving them to the disciples to set before the people. And the people ate, and they were satisfied. And on top of that, there were left over around 12 baskets full. In Matthew chapter 14, verse 15 to 21, I won't read all of those, but I'll just pick up what cannot be found in Luke. In Matthew, we can see here that Jesus said to the disciples that when the disciples proposed that they have to be sent away, Jesus said to them, they need not go away. They need not go away. And then he said, when the disciples said, now, what we have here are only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fishes. And then Jesus said, bring them here to me. Okay? So that's in Matthew. And then on the last that we can observe in Matthew that is not in Luke is that the number, the approximate 5,000, refer only to men, excluding women and children. So sabi ni John MacArthur sa kanyang Study Bible Guide, if you include the number of those women and children, approximately they will reach around 20,000. Okay? So, Mark chapter 6, verse 35 to 44. Here, in NASB, hindi mo siya makuha yung difference, no? But in King James, there is this word, sentence in verse 36 that they have nothing to eat, no? So, walang dalang pagkain ang mga multitude. So, sa verse 37, there is also that statement where the disciples said, "Shall we go and spend 200 denarii on bread and give them something to eat?" And then there is that also statement of Jesus found in Mark, which he asked the disciples, "How many loaves do you have? Go, look." Okay? Now, let's go to the next passage, the next account in chapter 6 of John. Here we can see a lot of things, no, that are not found in Luke, Matthew, and in Mark. The first thing that we can find in John chapter 6 is that Jesus already knew, what he would do even before the crowd were coming to him. And he was testing Philip. He said, "Where are we to buy bread so that this may eat?" And it says here, Jesus said that to test him, for Jesus himself knew what he was intending to do. Okay? And then Philip answered, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, for everyone to receive a little. Okay? So in-emphasize niya na we don't have enough resources. And if we have, then that's not even enough to give them a little, each one of them. And in verse 9, there is a statement here that will tell us who is the source of the 5 loaves of bread and the fish. It's a lad, no? It's a young man, it's a young boy, okay? And then there is also a statement that the disciple says, "But what are these meager resources, yung konti lang na resources, kumpara sa mga maraming tao against the many people?" And then in verse 12 of chapter 6 of John, we can read that Jesus commanded to gather the leftover fragments so that nothing will be lost. Okay? And verse 14, unique to John, is that it says that the people saw the sign and that Jesus performed, and they said, "This is truly the prophet who is to come into the world." So from that 4 accounts, we can come up with a complete story, no? The complete story is that when Jesus saw the multitude, he said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so that they may eat?" And he said this to test Philip, because he knew already what he intended to do. And Philip answered, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, for everyone to receive a little. Now the apostles, when the day was about to end, the apostles approached Jesus and then advised him, or suggested that send the crowd away, that they may go into the surrounding villages and countryside and find looking and get something to eat. For we are in a desolate place, for they have nothing to eat. But Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." And then they said to him, "Shall we go and spend 200 denarii on bread and give them something to eat?" And Jesus said to them, "How many loaves do you have? Go and look." And then the disciples said, "There is a lad here who has 5 loaves of bread and 2 fishes. And then he said, "Bring them here to me." And then he commanded to have the people sit. And then he took the bread, he looked up to heaven, he blessed, he divided the food, and then he gave it to the disciples, and the disciples gave it to the multitude. And the multitude ate, they were filled, and there were leftovers, which is 12 baskets full. And then the people said, "This is the prophet who is to come into the world." So that's the complete story, okay? Coming from the four accounts of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. Now, the theme of this passage is as follows, no? Or the main idea of this passage is that God used meager resources. When we say meager, insufficient, kulang, no? And He can multiply them to feed multitude, to strengthen the apostles. This is the purpose of this miracle, to strengthen the apostles to depend on Him and commit to Him what they have when He commanded them to do something beyond their resources. So that's the theme. That's the main idea of this passage, no? The key verse is in Luke chapter 9, verse 16, where we can read that Jesus took the bread, He looked up to heaven, He blessed, and He divided the food and gave it to the disciples, and the disciples gave it to the multitude. Now, what are our points here? Number one is that God is able to use little things to accomplish much, because God is powerful over scarcity. No? So God is able to use little things to accomplish much because He has power over scarcity. Okay? I hope this will encourage us, no? Little things can be used by God to meet much need. In our account, in our story, God used the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes to feed the 5,000 men. Okay? If including women and children, the number would have reached 20,000. 20,000. So it was God's power, no, that caused the multiplication of the little food to feed around 5,000 or 20. Now we can safely conclude that those little resources were multiplied to much because at the end of the story it says the 5,000 were fed and they were satisfied, and it has even excess, no, leftovers of around 12 baskets full of fragments. So the story clearly tells us that it was a miracle. Miracle talaga siya. Because there was scarcity and there were a lot of people to be fed, 5,000 men, and it was beginning of the night. They were in a desolate place. They have nothing to eat. The only food they have was 5 loaves and 2 fish. So that miracle was demonstration of power over scarcity. God can transform scarcity into abundance. Yung story ng miracle of the feeding of the 5,000 men is the only miracle, no, together with the resurrection, that are recorded in the 4 Gospels, according to John MacArthur. No, I haven't studied it by myself, but according to him, among the many miracles, this is the one, together with the resurrection, that are recorded in all 4 Gospels. In all 4 Gospels. This miracle demonstrates the creative power of God more clearly than any other miracle. Kasi nakapag-produce siya ng bagay out of nothing. So, ganun ang kanyang kapangyarihan when He created the world. He created the world out of nothing. By His mere speaking, things came into being. So, the feeding of the 5,000 clearly demonstrated the creative power of God than any other miracle. Sir Irving Jensen, he said, it decisively supported John's purpose when John wrote the gospel to demonstrate that the deity of Jesus, while also serving to set the stage for Jesus' discourse that He is the bread of life. In John chapter 6, verse 20 to 24. Now, how did Jesus multiply the food? How did Jesus multiply the food? The story only mentioned that he took the bread, he took the fish. That's the first step he did. Second, he looked up to heaven. Third, he blessed. And then fourth, he divided the food. And then fifth, he gave it to the disciples. And the disciples gave it to the multitude. That's the only thing that we can read from the passage. No? He did 5 things. He took the loaves, he looked up to heaven, he blessed, and then he broke the food, and then he gave it to the disciples, for the disciples to give it to the multitude. If you read John, he combined Act number 2 and number 3 into that Jesus gave thanks. No? So he combined looking up to heaven and blessed with Jesus giving thanks. Okay? Actually, these are not the only miracle of God and even Jesus, no, that the specific procedure of the execution of the power of God is not mentioned. Like yung turning of water into wine, no? We don't know when it actually converted into wine. Was it during when the water was poured in the water pots? Or was it during it was served by the servant to the governor? Or was it during when the governor tasted the water which is converted into wine? We don't know because the passage doesn't tell us. Okay? Same with the battle of Joshua, no, with the inhabitants of Canaan. No? According to chapter 12, verse 24, he killed around 31 kings. 31 kings, no, from the kingdom of Jericho to Ai, and the rest of the kingdom of that land, no? Multiple kings, 31 kings. And most of the time, the verse only mentions that God delivered the enemies to the Israelite. It didn't mention how. Except yung nasa chapter 10, verse 11 and 12 of Joshua, wherein it tells us that God discomfited the enemy. He sent hailstone from heaven, which, as a result, many were killed, even more than the sword. So, ano kaya ang reason of the omission, no, of the specific action or the procedure of the power of God? Now, I think the main reason is for us to fully depend on Him. Not on what He can really do, but more on who He is. And secondarily, of what He can do. If you look at John chapter 6, verse 2, this is the error of the multitude. Great crowd, according to that verse, followed Him because they saw the miraculous signs Jesus had performed on the sick. So they followed Jesus now for the wrong reason. They wanting to see kung gaano ka makapangyarihan o kamanghamang bagay ang kaya niyang pwedeng gawin, no? People followed Him not out of faith, but out of curiosity concerning the miracles that He performed. In fact, after they were fed, we can read no, sa John 6:26, Jesus said to them, I tell you the truth, you are looking for me because you saw miraculous signs, but not because you saw miraculous signs, but because you ate the loaves and you had your fill. So the crowd were motivated to see the signs and also motivated to be fed. But what God wants us to do is we follow Him because we know who He is, and secondarily because we know what He can do. Now, I hope this first point will encourage us what God can do. What God can do. It doesn't matter anymore how He will do it. Minsan kasi sa buhay natin, pag nagmando ang Diyos, in our human and finite reasoning, we always think of the procedure. Paano kaya mangyari yun? Paano kaya? Leave it to God. Leave it to God. Just depend on Him. I invited my wife, to to share a story. So, Han, can you tell a story about God's powerful work no, over scarcity?
Okay, good morning po. This is lifted from Kay Arthur's book, Lord, I'm Torn Between Two Masters. It's entitled Christmas Eve in Romania. Okay, isolated from the rest of the outside world, it was difficult with the 7 children to celebrate the birth of Jesus when their stomachs were empty. There were no decorations, no brightly lit candles, no Christmas trees, no cookies, and no beautiful wrapped gifts to exchange. The children were just as hungry today as any other day. Soon, Dad would be telling the children about the Messiah born in a manger, much like the little hut they lived in. This father, mother, and their 7 children, all under 14 years of age, were banished into exile in the far reaches of an uninhabited part of the country. The communist authorities hated the father because of his convicting preaching. He was nicknamed by the believers the Golden Word because of his eloquence. They were forced to move to a little village inaccessible by car or train. What food they were given was flown in by helicopter. They lived in a tiny hut with a straw roof under the constant surveillance of the prison guards. The village was established for those undesirables of society, which includes religious fanatics. The stinging chill was made worse by the wind whipping snow across the flat, barren land, unbroken by hills, and whistling its song through every crack and crevice in the small hut. For 2 days, the guards had not bothered to bring them any food. They were too busy preparing their own celebrations with wine and pork. The children listened intently to their father, telling them the story of Jesus, huddled together around the dim light of the gas lantern on the table. They were so intent they forgot about their hunger. But when the story was over, one after the other began to cry. Before going to bed that Christmas Eve, the whole family knelt down on the dirt floor and prayed as never before. Our Father, which art in heaven, give us this day our daily bread. After they finished their prayer and said amen, the children asked their mother and father many questions. Do you think God heard our prayer? Of course he did. But what if he didn't hear it? That isn't possible, the father replied. Do you think he will send us bread? They asked. Yes, I'm sure he will, said the father. But when? They cried. The parents, heartbroken to see their children crying from hunger, could not answer. The children continued to ask, Who will he send to bring us bread? He will find someone, said the father. But what if he doesn't find anyone? Well, then, the father paused. He himself will bring it with his own hand. Now close your eyes and go to sleep. The father blew out the little lantern as darkness descended on them, and the wind whistled to them in their sleep. Suddenly, the still darkness was shattered, a knock on the door. The father got out of bed and opened the door, just a crack to keep the cold from blowing inside. A hand, holding a large loaf of bread, was stretched toward him. His heart pounding, the father reached out to take the bread, and at the same time opened the door widely to say thank you. But at that very moment, in the twinkling of an eye, the hand was gone. There was no one there. Bewildered, the father closed the door and turned around. All 7 children leaped out of bed and surrounded him. Who was it, Dad? Who gave you the bread? Children, he said with a tremble in his voice, the Lord did not find anyone to send to us with bread. So he himself came and gave it to us with his own hand. Nobody could sleep anymore that Christmas Eve. The children couldn't stop singing about Jesus and about how the Lord had spread a table for them in the wilderness. Thank you po.
Thank you. Let's go to point number 2. So, our first point is that God has power over scarcity. Second is that the miracle is for the disciples. And the miracle was intended to strengthen the disciples to depend on God and commit to Him what they had. So, yun ang layunin ng miracle, no? Para ito sa mga apostles. Hindi po siya para sa mga multitude. Okay? So, remember in John chapter 6, the next slide, it says here, Therefore Jesus, verse 5, lifting up his eyes and seeing that a large crowd was coming to him, he said to Philip, Where are we to buy bread so that this may eat? This he was saying to test him, for he himself knew what he was intending to do. If you study the book of John, Irving Jensen made an excellent outline when he surveyed the book of John. He divided the book into 5 major parts. He said that chapter 1 to chapter 4 is about the introduction of Jesus. No? Broadly, that segment speaks about how Jesus is introduced by people, by witnesses, by Him doing miracles, and by Him declaring who He is. And second component or segment is, after He was introduced, what was the reaction of people? So, some people believed, some didn't believe, and some even went to the length of rejecting, opposing Him. So the next segment is about Jesus deepening the faith of those who believe on Him, and while He did something to deepen their faith, the other group continued to heighten their opposition and rejection of Jesus Christ. And then chapter 12, verse 36 to chapter 17, that's the exclusive communion of Jesus with His apostles. To strengthen them, it's an intimate time, private time with Jesus of these 11 apostles, because Judas had left already. And chapter 18 and 19, it's arrest, crucifixion, trial, and death. And then the next 2 chapters is about resurrection. So it is in the second segment where we can find this story, chapter 6, the feeding of the 5,000. Na gusto ni Jesus na palalimin ang pananampalataya ng mga disciples. Okay? Remember our preaching in April and May, wherein Jesus already stopped proclaiming the truth, and He intentionally proclaimed it by parables because He wanted to obscure the truth from the mob, from the multitude, because despite of the sufficient disclosure that He had done of who He is, they continued not to believe in Him. Kaya sa pananaw ng ating Panginoong Hesus, wala nang silbi ang Kanya it's no longer necessary because the people continue only to not believe in Him. So this time, nilalaan niya ito para sa mga apostles, para palalimin ang kanilang pananampalataya. Kaya nga sa book ng Luke, itong kwento na ito na chapter 9 verse 12 to 17, na sandwich ito sa isang story na pinadala niya ang mga apostles on their first assignment, and then after that they returned, and this is the miracle that he showed to them, and then after that he said this. Sabi niya sa chapter 9 verse 18 to 20, tinanong niya ang mga apostles na, anong sabi ng mga tao kung sino ako? So sabi ng mga apostles, sabi nila, ikaw daw si John the Baptist. Sabi naman ng iba, ikaw daw ay si Elias. Yung iba sabi, isa ka daw sa mga old prophet na nabuhay muli. And then Jesus asked them, but how about you? Who do you say I am? And then one of them, as the representative, Peter said, you are the Christ. You are the Christ. So, yan ang pakay ni Jesus, no, kung bakit niya pinakita niya itong 5,000 na miracle, feeding of the 5,000 miracle, no? Now, in the process of deepening their faith, makita natin dito yung maling approach ng mga apostles sa problema of scarcity, at makita natin dito ang pagwasto ni Kristo sa kanilang kamalian. So yun yung ating titingnan ngayon, no? Okay? What was that erroneous approach, which is mainly typically human when we approach scarcity or any problem, and then how does Jesus correct that erroneous approach, no? Now, let's start with reiterating the reality of the problem. So, the reality of the problem is this, that there was scarcity. 5 factors, no? There was multitude, around 5,000 to 20,000, including women and children. And it's already evening. They were in a desolate place, and they have nothing to eat because they are not bringing with them food. And what the apostles had is only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fishes. So there was a real problem, as you can read from the story. Okay? Now, let's look at the first approach of the apostle. The first approach is what we call, which is typically human, the easy way out approach of solving scarcity or problem. Okay? Now, the easy way out refers to the easiest but not the best way of doing something, especially a way that does not involve much effort. It can also refer to what is easiest in a difficult situation. Next slide. The phrase can be used also to describe a solution or means of dealing with a situation or problem, next, that requires the least amount of effort or hardship but which does not meaningfully resolve it. So, ang kanilang approach sa mga apostle is easy way out. Easy way out, no? We can prove that in verse 12 of chapter 9. Let's read chapter 9, verse 12. It says, "Now the day was ending, and the 12 came and said to him, 'Send the crowd away.'" An easy way approach, no? "That they may go on their own and buy food and feed themselves." So ayaw nilang ma-involve. Ayaw nilang ma-involve. "Find lodging and get something to eat, for we are here in a desolate place." Sa Matthew 4:15, sabi dito, "When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, 'This place is desolate and the hour is already late. So send the crowds away that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves.'" Now, if you study the reason why people approach the easy way out, essentially there are only 2 reasons, no? Number 1 is lack of compassion towards the plight of people. Lack of compassion. Lack of compassion. You know, in my ministry with Dasma, ang na-observe ko talaga, no, one of the things that I observed is si Gloria Basilio. She had that compassion talaga towards people, no? We have itatay, no, 72 years old. Nung nagkaroon siya ng PTB, talagang sinasamahan siya ni Gloria. That will not leave God helpless, no? Look at the story kanina sa Christmas in Romania. Siya mismo, yung kanyang kamay, ang nagdala ng tinapay. Kaya ang larawan natin bilang iglesia dito sa 1 Corinthians chapter 12 is tayo ang katawan, tayo ang bibig, tayo ang kamay, tayo ang paa ng Diyos. Okay? Napaka-pribilehiyo na maging kabahagi, no? Maging maanyayahan tayo ng Diyos, maging kabahagi. And let's not draw away, no, from the solution to the problem. Let's be involved, no? Let's be part. Now, the second typical human approach to solving scarcity, we can learn this from the apostles, no? They look at what? Their insufficiency. And second, they compare that with the magnitude of the problem. And third is, they doubted if the scarcity will be solved. Okay? They look at their insufficiency, they compare it with the magnitude of the problem of what they have, and then they doubted. No, walang way to. So, the insufficiency issues among them is that they don't have enough money to buy, even to give them little food. And then they said, what we have is so insufficient versus the need. Look at chapter 9, next slide, of verse 13 of Luke. When Jesus said to them, "You give them something to eat," anong kanilang tugon? "We have no more than 5 loaves and 2 fish, unless we go and buy food for all these people." Same with Matthew 14:17. And in Mark 16, verse 37, they said, "Shall we go and spend 200 denarii on bread and give them something to eat?" Now, according to Matthew 20, verse 2, and Matthew 22, verse 19, ang isang denarius is equivalent to a one person's wage. No? So, kung sabihin na natin na 6 ang araw ng pagtatrabaho, itong 200 is katumbas ng 7 buwan hanggang 8 buwan na sahod ng isang tao during the time. So, ang laki ng perang kailangan nila para man lang mabili yung maliit na maibigay sa bawat isa, hindi pa sapat. So, ini-emphasize ng mga apostles na kahit nga maglikom tayo ng pera ngayon na hindi naman natin kayang likumin, hindi pa rin yan enough na magbigay ng kahit kakaunti sa bawat isa. So John 6, verse 7, the next slide, Philip answered, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, for everyone to receive a little. And in verse 9, they said to Jesus, "We have this lad who has 5 loaves and 2 fish. But ano bang silbi nito sa ating problema, sa bigat ng ating hinaharap na pagkukulang?" That's the approach, no, of the apostles. Now look at the correction of Jesus now, how he corrected. In Mark 6, verse 38, he said, "How many loaves do you have? Go, look." You know what? There is nothing wrong with you looking at your insufficiency. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, it's encouraged, no? You have an actual assessment of what you have. And there's nothing wrong if you will realize and appreciate how much is the problem is. Walang problema din doon. Ang problema kung kopyahin natin yung pangatlo na dahil sa bigat ng problema at dahil sa kulang na meron tayo, titigil na tayo. Hindi tayo hahakbang na manampalataya sa Diyos na kaya niyang gawin ang ating kung anong meron tayo. Sabi ni Jesus, "How many loaves do you have? Look." So he is equivalent to saying, look at your insufficiency. What do you have? What do you have? And then sabi niya, verse 14, you read, he said, "Bring them to me." Entrust what you have to the Lord. And let Him use that to multiply and feed many. Let's surrender, no? Katulad ng pag-surrender ng mga apostles because of the command of Jesus. So, you look at how Jesus feed. He took the bread, the insufficient, the meager, the limited resources, kinuha niya. He looked up to heaven, He blessed, He broke them, and He distributed them to the apostles. So God can use our present resources and obedience to entrust them to produce miraculous things. Let's surrender, no? Let's entrust to God what we have and let Him use that. I have a testimony, no? I testified before you that when I started DASMA work, I had it somewhat, questioning that, is this the best use of my time? And then the Lord just comforted me na, yes. If this will lead you to know me, that's more than enough motivation. So, and then I also found out na yung line of question na yun, galing yun sa aking somehow pride, no? Feeling of superior na parang, is this my crowd? And then the Lord has had a sense of humor, no? Itong BAM, Business as a Mission, is continuing to expand. Last March, nag-launch kami sa Davao. Last May, nag-launch kami sa Cebu. Ngayong last month ng July, mag-launch kami back-to-back sa Bacolod and Iloilo. And when we expanded, and the next few months sa Northern Luzon, no, nakita ko ang daming mga sumasali ng mga affluent, mga kilalang businessmen, no, na parang na-intimidate ako na, ano ba ang makontribute ko dito? Parang out of place yata ako. I have that inadequate feeling talaga. Hindi ko lang sinasabi kay F kasi nung pumunta kami sa Davao, ayaw niyang makipagsabay doon sa mga kainan, no? Kasi minsan, pag nandoon ka, nag-uusap sila, anong lifestyle, minsan hindi ka makasabay, no? I have nothing against the rich people, no? Meron na talaga mga ganung pagkakataon na parang meron kang crowd na comfortable ka. But then the Lord just comforted me, no? Na just use your tax competence, your accounting knowledge, and then your exposure, rich experience for how many years in dealing with the government. Just yield that to me. Yield that to me, no? So, last slide, no? I want you to evaluate, no? What is your material resources na tingin mo kulang? Pangalawa, economic position, no? Na maaring sa pananaw mo parang maliit lang. Pangatlo, yung ating educational attainment. Pang-apat, yung ating katayuan sa trabaho, work position. Fifth, yung ating talino. 6, yung ating personality. 7, yung ating ability. Okay? Ang ating talent. If you feel insufficient, if you feel inadequate, normal naman yun. Kasi sabi nga ni Jesus, look at what you have. And if you compare what is needed and you are so insufficient, normal lang din yun. Kasi kapag na-size up mo talaga exactly what you have and what you need, mas define ang iyong panalangin. Nakuha nyo? Mas klaro kung anong kailangan mo kay God. Mas forceful ang iyong pagkatulak na pumunta sa Diyos dahil alam mong kailangan mo siya. Kailangan mo siya. Hindi ko to kaya on my own. And God exactly structured our life to be that way because He wanted us to depend not on us but on Him. On Him. God is dependable and He is able to do miraculous things if we surrender our lives to Him and offer whatever little we have. No? Whatever little we have. Tayo po'y manalangin. Whatever God has spoken to you this morning, you respond to Him. Kayo po'y tumugon, no? Kausapin niyo ang Diyos sa mga binubunyag niya sa inyo ngayong umaga. Maybe it's about your insufficiency. Maybe it's about the magnitude of your problem. Or maybe your lack of compassion, no? Or you don't want to be part of the solution of the problem because it's a hassle, no? It's inconvenient. Or maybe you need to really believe God that He is able. He has power over scarcity.